This is a Sports Catastrophe production. Hey there, Heather, ho there. It's Jeff Cutastrophe welcoming you to another Sports Catastrophe on this day. And on this day, Monday, well, not really a Monday, but on March 22nd, in 1979, the NHL changed forever. Yes, the NHL and the WHA, even though they were major rivals in hockey, professional hockey, they decided on a merger. There were a lot of negotiations. The thing on March 22nd, 1979, would be that 4 of the 6 WHA teams in the 78-79 season would go to the NHL, and the other 2 would basically be taken out. Their players would be in a dispersal draft and basically bought out, in a sense. The 2 teams had discussed the possibility of merging for numerous years. Despite the relationship between the 2, when the WHA recruited NHL players when they founded the league in 71. 2 sides came into agreement in 1977. However, the NHL owners rejected the merger. In 1979, it was actually rejected by 1 vote the first time. However, due to a massive boycott of Molson products in Canada, Molson plants getting bombed and all that, because they figured that Molson didn't want to share the TV rights, especially with Quebec and Winnipeg. Well, Quebec would be OK. The Habs and the Canucks would actually reverse their position, and it passed. As part of the agreement, the NHL treated the WHA's arrival as an expansion rather than an outright merger, kind of like what the NBA did. The former WHA clubs restricted most of their players, and NHL teams were given the right to reclaim players from the WHA clubs without compensation. However, the former WHA clubs would be allowed to keep 2 goalies and 2 skaters, and the 4 former WHA teams were also placed at the end of the draft order for the 79 NHL entry draft. Basically, that most expansion teams are near the front, but they put them at the back. So basically, the NHL was the only major professional hockey league after the Western Canadian Hockey League in 1926 folded. Basically, that meant the NHL had the exclusive rights to the Stanley Cup and all that. Despite the NHL only having 6 franchises starting from 42 to 67, despite the fact there were plenty of franchises in the 1930s, the NHL was stable. There were rumors that the Western Hockey League, a Western American club, wanted to make it itself a major league. The NHL said they would expand past 6 teams, so they added 6 teams for 1968. That being Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Minnesota, St. Louis, Oakland, and Pittsburgh, Philly, St. Louis, Minnesota, Oakland, and Los Angeles. The league would triple in size to 18 teams for 1974. In 1971, the WHA was founded with 10 teams to try to be a direct competitor to the NHL. Kind of like what the ABA and the AFL did for basketball and football, respectively. Baseball would not really have a direct competitor for professional stuff, although the Continental League kind of was close in the 1960s, but that actually led baseball to expand from 16 teams on. By its inaugural year of 72-73, 67 NHL players defected to the new league. Bobby Hall was the biggest signing, because when Winnipeg signed him, it was credibility to the fledgling circuit when he got the 10-year, $2.7 million contract. The NHL tried to block the defections, and it did have an injunction against the Jets that initially prevented players from playing the WHA. But the WHA challenged the order, saying that the NHL's reserve clause was illegal, which tied players' rights to their AHL team for life. The reserve clause was basically fought for by baseball, especially with the couldve movement. Unfortunately for the NHL, the WHA got their rights in November 72, striking down the reserve clause, and basically the players could play in the WHA. The WHA decided to challenge the NHL by placing teams in NHL markets, such as the Philadelphia Blazers, where the Flyers were, the Vancouver Blazers, who moved from Philadelphia to try to compete against the Canucks, the Toronto Toros, who would compete against the Leafs, and the Chicago Cougars, who would challenge the Blackhawks. However, the WHA actually prompted the NHL to hastily expand to Atlanta and Long Island to keep the rival loop out of the 2 new arenas. The Flames and Islanders would be in the NHL. There were a lot of merger talks, even. But there was a lot of problems still too. Clarence Campbell didn't like it because, there are rivals. Why would we establish them now? But the WHA, for all its talk and all its stuff, had too many expansions and too many relocations to count. And basically, they oversaturated themselves. Now, there were rumors circulating that the WHA could come as soon as 1977. However, the Canadian teams were hostile to the idea of a merger because they didn't want to share TV rights with any other Canadian club in there. Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal held the monopoly of rights and all that. Many American teams believed they were able to do this because Canadian Hockey Night in Canada revenues was distributed around the three teams instead of across the league. Hence, adding Canadian teams would lessen the financial advantage that teams like Montreal had. Also, the NHL and WHA owners realized that the Canadian markets were a vital economic base and all that. So yeah, it happened that way. There was a revised plan for the 78-79 season. And so there was a final agreement and that the NHL had 17 teams and needed 13 votes. Unfortunately, in Key Largo, March 8th, 1979, 12 submitted the proposal. The 5 that voted against it were Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, as expected because it's Canadian, Boston, and Los Angeles. Boston mostly because the Whalers were slated, the New England Whalers, and not the Hartford Whalers because New England had to change its name because Boston didn't like the name the New England Whalers. They represent New England, but Boston is. The Toronto Maple, as we all know, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal because of the TV rights. And Los Angeles, for some reason, I don't know why they thought it was not a good idea. Because the expansion would have been in Quebec City, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Hartford. That's hard to believe. Why Los Angeles said no? But they did it for major reasons. The Bruins were not pleased with the prospect of sharing New England with the Whalers, and the Habs did not want to share the province of Quebec with the Nordiques. And of course, the three teams, Canadians, Canucks, and Leafs, disliked having the idea of having split Hockey Night in Canada revenues 6 ways instead of 3. Harold Ballard had a grudge against the WHA. That's not surprising. The Kings actually said that they didn't want to lose dates with NHL teams from the East. Kind of puzzling. So, basically, Molson Brewery was behind this. Usually Montreal and all them. But because of that, fans in Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Quebec City decided to boycott Molson products. Basically, Molson had troubles. The boycott was nationwide, and it caused a drain on the Canucks revenue because Pacific Coliseum sold a lot of Molson products. The House of Commons even said that they should have the NHL to reconsider. And a second vote was held as Montreal and Vancouver, who voted against the first 79 proposal, decided to reverse it, mostly because of the Molson shit and all that. The Canucks were actually won over by the promise of a balanced schedule that each team would play the other twice at home and twice on the road. And all that. Now, there was a rumor circulating that this whole Vancouver's involvement was because the owner and chairman of the Canucks, Arthur Griffiths, or was it Frank Griffiths? I think it was Frank Griffiths, said that he couldn't go to the board meeting, so he sent his second in command, or his latchkey, if you will. And basically, his second in command thought that Griffiths didn't like the vote. So he voted for no. But Griffiths, after realizing that his own second in command actually voted against the merger when he wanted the merger, promptly fired him. And basically, that was also why Vancouver voted yes on the thing. So basically, the Oilers, Whalers, Nordiques, and Jets would join the NHL for the 1980 season. And all the WHA teams had to pay a $6 million franchise fee for the right to enter the NHL. Basically, it wasn't that bad of a deal. The two remaining WHA teams, the Cincinnati Stingers and the Birmingham Bulls, were paid $1.5 million in parachute payments and joined the Central Hockey League. The league owned minor league for one season each. Cincy would fold. Birmingham would play 2 seasons before folding. Cincy and Birmingham would not have major pro hockey and all that. People forget that Cincy and Birmingham were still around the WHA. Everything was basically slanted in the NHL's favor because of the NHL draft. However, the WHA kind of made a move that forced the NHL to draft 18-year-olds starting in 1979 instead of 19-year-olds. And all that. Of course, the league refused to recognize WHA records. The 4 franchises were given new entities. The Canadian teams were permitted to operate under their names, colors, and logos and personnel. However, the Whalers, unfortunately, would have a couple of changes. The big change was they were not supposed to be called the New England Whalers because of Boston in the New England area. So they decided to be the Hartford Whalers instead. And the Whalers had to change their logo because the harpoon was in the W in the WHA logo. There was a harpoon in it. And basically they took it out with a distinguished HW and all that. The WHA would take a while to get used to the lifestyle of the NHL. But before that, let's talk about the 79 expansion draft, entry draft, because the minimum draft age was lowered from 20 to 19 because of the WHA clubs and all that. And the NHL shortened the draft to 6 rounds and all that. Wayne Gretzky was not in the draft because the Oilers used one of their 2 protected picks on him and all that. Well, Gretzky had a personal service contract with Peter Pocklington of the Oilers. Gretzky thought that he would have to play for Colorado if he were entered the draft, refused to void his contract with Pocklington. But Edmonton was allowed to keep Gretzky in exchange for being in the bottom of the draft order in the entry draft. Colorado would end up getting Rob Ramage from the Birmingham of the WHA, one of the 2 squads to fold. So basically, Rob Ramage was back in town and all that. For the Colorado Rockies. St. Louis would pick second and picked from the WHL. Not from the WHA, but they played Perry Turnbull. Detroit would pick Mike Foligno 3rd overall. WHA members who were drafted in the 79 draft. Mike Gardner was drafted to Washington from Cincy. Birmingham lost Rick Five and Craig Hartsburg, who went to Vancouver and Minnesota, respectively. A pair of Kitchener Rangers were in the first round. Paul Reinhart and Doug Sullivan, although Doug Sullivan was a bust. Michel Goulet was in the Birmingham team in WHA and made it to Quebec. The first pick for Hartford was Ray Allison, a right winger from Brandon, which basically wrote a lot of Canadian major junior records. Winnipeg's first pick was right winger Jimmy Mann from the Sherbrooke Crafters of the Quebec League. Quebec's first pick was Michel Goulet, and Edmonton's first pick was Kevin Lowe, who became the first Anglo captain of the Quebec Ramparts in the Quebec Junior League. All that. So yeah, some WHA guys. Gaston Shingra, who played for Birmingham, went to Montreal. Pat Regan, who was the goalie for Birmingham, went to Atlanta. Who else? Cincy. Mark Messier was drafted in the 3rd round by Edmonton. He played for Cincy. I'm shocked that, Messier wasn't drafted higher. That's the biggest move. Like, Detroit drafted a right winger named Jody Gage from the Kitchener Rangers, but he didn't turn out to be good. Man, 47 teams passed on Mark Messier before Edmonton got him. I mean, Boston drafted Doug Morrison as a right winger. Fuck, he could have given Messier. Sorry, I'm just a little bit on the pissed off side. But anyway, so yeah, the WHA teams coming into the NHL, they didn't get much fodder and all that. Basically, it would take a while and all that. Winnipeg, despite the fact that they actually did good in the WHA and saturated the European market of players, would take a while, especially a 30-game winless streak in the 1980-81 season, their second ever. But that did give them the number 1 pick and got Dale Hawerchuk, who was a fan favorite for a decade. The Jets would soon become playoff good teams and basically did the Sea of White with every fan wearing white and all that. Sadly, though, for the Jets, finances, the Canadian dollar would screw them, and Winnipeg moved to Phoenix for the 1996 season. The Whalers did okay. The Hartford Whalers were fine. They even faced Montreal in their first playoff, the first season in the playoffs. And Gordie Howe scored his last professional goal against the Montreal Canadiens, but Montreal swept Hartford in 3 straight games. Hartford would take a while. They would only win one playoff series while in the city of Hartford in their history from 1979 to 1997. And that was in 86 when they shocked the Quebec Nordiques, who won the Adams Division. And almost pulled one off against Montreal in Game 7 of the division finals, but unfortunately Claude Lemieux scored an overtime goal. Hartford would, of course, move to Carolina in 97. Quebec City would have a big rival. The Nordiques and Habs would have a great rival, the Battle of Quebec. And then basically it went down to La Bataille Saint Vendredi, or the Good Friday Massacre, to you and me, in April of 1984. Quebec was a decent team. They had some great talent. A lot of them were French Canadian, but whatever. Quebec City was basically more French Canadian than Montreal, so basically they had all the French players. Montreal still had some French players, but Quebec City didn't want to draft too many English-born people. They didn't really draft. Well, the Stasies came over from the Czech Republic. Quebec Nordiques were decent, but they just couldn't pull off runs, but they could. In '85, they got to the conference finals against Philly, but lost in 5 games. And so, yeah. And then they moved to Colorado because of the stupid Canadian dollar. Despite the fact that the Nordiques were the best team in the NHL in '95. Well, the best team in the Eastern Conference, I meant. But basically, their playoff failures ruined them, and then they moved to Colorado just days after. Edmonton is the only WHA city that's still in existence today in its original city. Edmonton went to the playoffs. Like, they had Gretzky, Messier, and Yari Curry. They basically were a young team. They got to the finals in '83 and basically learned that the New York Islanders, despite them winning their 4th title, were not really in a party mood. And basically, Gretzky and Messier both knew that it took a lot of guts in the playoffs, and they changed their way of thinking, and that's why they won all those cups. All that. So, yeah. It's amazing. However, the merger also helped the league reconsidering other Canadian cities for teams and all that. 1 year after the merger, in August of 1980, the Atlanta Flames would relocate to Calgary to become the Flames and arch rivals of the Oilers. The NHL added an expansion team in Ottawa in '92, which was shocking because a lot of people thought Ottawa didn't have the finances and all that. And both those teams are in their respective cities. And the league, unfortunately, has projected bids to give Hamilton or Saskatoon NHL franchises. You can't win them all, but you can frickin' win at least once. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.